A lot of people have asked me how I came to be interested in writing a book about the mob. And so I thought I would explain that initially before I get into the actual text of the book. My father had a great uncle named Irving Kay, who was a bootlegger. And I only met him once, but he was indicted but never tried for the murder of Dutch Schultz in 1935. And that was my first introduction to any information about the mob. In the late 1950s, when I was a teenager, I worked for my father on Saturdays. My father owned two garment manufacturing facilities, one in Queens, one in Brooklyn. And my job was fairly menial. Most of the time I would sweep up the floor, I would pick up leftover cloth and dispose of it. But my job was also to bring up bolts of clothing, bolts of cloth rather, from the basement to the cutter's table, and the bolts would be unrolled, and then patterns would be placed over them to cut out dresses. One day, while I was bringing up a bolt of cloth, I heard my father and another man screaming at one another, and I stopped and watched them. My father's fists were clenched. He had been an amateur boxer as a teenager, and so he looked like he was ready to punch this other man. And the other man was yelling back at him. And my father said to the man finally, he said, "Get the F out of here." And the other man pointed his right index finger at my father like a gun, and he said, "We're going to get you." And when we left the factory at about 1 o'clock, we were driving home, and I asked my father what that was about. And he said that was a notorious gangster named Johnny Dio, who had wanted to unionize my father's workers. However, the workers decided that they did not want to be unionized by him because actually they would have earned less money because of dues and other things that they would have had to pay out of their paychecks. In addition, he wanted my father to use his trucking company. He was connected to the Teamsters Union and controlled a lot of the trucking in the garment industry. So I didn't know what was going to happen. The following week, my parents took me out for dinner. I had just graduated from a junior high school. And while we were out, people had broken into our kitchen and destroyed it pretty much. They threw everything around. They turned over the refrigerator. They threw food and liquid all over the kitchen. And it wasn't until quite a bit later that I realized that these people who had intimidated my father were sending an additional message that he better cooperate. Well, my mother had a cousin who, during the Depression, he and his brother operated an Italian grocery store in a section of Queens called Corona. And they would take turns operating the store. One semester, one would go to law school at St. John's University, and the next semester, the other one would go. And because most of their customers were immigrant Italians who worked paycheck to paycheck, they used to lend them money for various things. And ultimately, they began lending them money to put down payments on homes, which led them to form a title insurance company and a mortgage company. But some of the people that they dealt with were involved with the mob. And my mother's cousin became involved with them. And my father turned to my mother's cousin to ask his advice and his help, because the previous year, this cousin of my mother's had been indicted for the torching of a warehouse in the Bronx, and my father had paid his bail. Well, this cousin was sort of an associate of mobsters and knew a lot about them. And he was able to negotiate a deal for my father whereby my father had to accept the trucking company, but he didn't have to accept unionization. And my father died 2 years later, and he had a partner who was not as strong as my father And eventually he kept giving more and more to the mob. They kept making more and more demands. Their trucking rates increased dramatically year by year until eventually he had to bring them in as partners. And years and years later, they did what was called a bust out, where they ran up all sorts of debts and used the merchandise that they had to earn money for themselves and never paid the debts. So that was another reason that I became interested in the mob. And then finally, in the 1980s, I became friendly with a man who was a doctor, and we became very good friends. And it turned out that his father had been in charge of all the gambling in New York for a gangster named Frank Costello, who was known as the prime minister of the underworld. And he had told me two interesting stories about Frank Costello. One, when this friend of mine graduated from high school, Frank Costello, who owned the Copacabana nightclub in New York, arranged for my friend and his date to get a ringside table at the Copacabana, and Frank Sinatra was singing there, and they had a wonderful evening, and they didn't have to pay for any of it. The other time was when he was in high school. One day, his father and Frank Costello drove up in a fancy limousine and took him up to Saratoga to the races, and they gave him several $100s to play with, to bet on the horses. So I learned a lot about the mob from him, and based on my own experiences, I thought that I would investigate doing a book about this. And I started at the beginning with a man named Arnold Rothstein, who allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series. And he was really the head of organized crime in New York. He was the man who organized it. Prior to Arnold Rothstein, there were many gangs in New York, usually ethnic gangs of Jews, Italians, Germans, and Irish, and they wound up fighting with each other and often working for the politicians. Arnold Rothstein believed that he could organize the gangs, and rather than work for the politicians, he could get the politicians to work for him. And Arnold Rothstein had 4 young proteges who he taught how to organize crime. And those young proteges were Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Lucky Luciano, and Frank Costello. And at the time, there were basically just 2 mafia families in New York. One was run by a man named Joe the Boss Mazzaria, and the other by a man named Salvatore Maranzano. And both of these men were very narrow-minded and objected to the fact that Luciano was associating with Jews, and not only with Jews, but Italians who didn't come from Sicily. He objected to the fact that some of them came from Naples and from Calabria and other places. And these 4 young proteges of Arnold Rothstein thought this was crazy. All they were interested in is money. They didn't care about someone's religious background or ethnic background. They just wanted to have an organization that could make a lot of money and not get involved in unnecessary violence. Well, in 1931, they finally decided that the way to do this was to assassinate Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. And these 4 men, well, not Meyer Lansky, but Lucky Luciano and Bugsy Siegel and some imported talent assassinated these 2 mafia heads. And once they had been assassinated, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky formed something called the National Crime Syndicate. Now, the National Crime Syndicate was made up primarily of Jews and Italians who decided that it was stupid for them to fight one another. They should all be allies. What's interesting is that they formed a commission on which both Italians and Jews served, and they actually oversaw what became the 5 mafia families. And Luciano arranged for the appointment of the heads of these 5 mafia families and appointed himself as the head of one of them. And when Prohibition came about, these people became multimillionaires. They just made a fortune from it. And they spread their wealth around and invested in a lot of legitimate and illegitimate businesses. And some of the Prohibition companies after Prohibition became legal brand name liquor companies that are still around today and are highly respected companies. But one of the things that was ultimately different about the Italian and Jewish gangsters, however, was that most of the Jewish gangsters did not want their sons to become gangsters. They wanted them to become professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, etc. Whereas the Italian mafia bosses wanted to build dynasties. They wanted their sons to inherit their families. Now there are also a lot of interesting stories and myths about people connected or associated with the mob that the public really doesn't know about. And one of the more fascinating characters is Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was a friend of Meyer Lansky and had tremendous respect and admiration for him. And one day, Meyer Lansky and his daughter were having dinner in a restaurant near the Palisades in New Jersey. And Frank Sinatra walked over to the table to say hello. And in the process of doing that, he knocked over a pitcher of water that fell on Meyer Lansky's daughter's lap. And Frank Sinatra, and this is around 1958 when Frank Sinatra was already a big star, got down on his hands and knees and took a napkin and was wiping off the dress of Meyer Lansky's daughter. And Meyer Lansky gave him such a hard look. Someone said it looked as if his eyes had turned from gray to black orbs. They were so intimidating. And but Meyer Lansky also felt that Frank Sinatra could serve a useful purpose, and used him for mob entertainment. So, for example, they had a big mob convention in Havana several years after World War II, and it was a convention in which Lucky Luciano attended, even though he had been deported from the United States and was living in Italy. Frank Sinatra was charged with bringing $1 million in an attaché case given to him by the two Fischetti brothers from Chicago to deliver to Lucky Luciano. And they felt that by giving the money to Sinatra, that no one would ask to see what was in the attaché case, and no one did. The FBI ultimately discovered this, and it's part of the FBI file on Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was not permitted to attend any of the meetings of the mob. He was just there primarily for entertainment. And he, after dinner, he would perform and sing for them. Meyer Lansky was grateful for this, and so he gave Frank Sinatra the marina concession for one of his hotels in Havana. Now, in the process of writing this book, I also interviewed a man who had been the casino manager at the Sands Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. And Sinatra used to perform there and also liked to gamble quite a bit there. And one night, Sinatra wanted a $50,000 credit for gambling. And the overall manager of the place, a man named Carl Cohn, refused to give it to him. And Sinatra became furious at this, that he wasn't given the credit. He felt that he deserved it as a major entertainer and as someone who patronized the Sands Hotel. So he demanded to see Carl Cohn, and Carl met him in the coffee shop at the Sands Hotel. And Sinatra became extremely belligerent, wound up calling Carl Cohn a dirty Jew. Carl Cohn lifted up Sinatra by his shirt collars and punched him in the face and knocked out his 4 front teeth. The the man I spoke to, who gave me this information, the manager, had to drive Sinatra to a local dental surgeon to have his lip sewn up because it was bleeding so badly. And then Sinatra flew back to Los Angeles, and he called this man's father, who was the biggest bookmaker on the East Coast and a member of the mob. And he also called Sam Giancana in Chicago. And he said to them that he wanted Carl Cohn killed. And they said, you can't kill Carl Cohn. He's one of us. And you're just an entertainer, but you're not one of us. And therefore, you have nothing to say about this. And then one of them reminded him, he said, look at who signs your checks. Carl Cohn signs your checks. And you can never touch him. He's protected. He's one of us. So I thought these stories were fascinating, and it was interesting because the public had this image of Frank Sinatra as sort of like a mob associate who had a tremendous power within the mob. He had tremendous power in the entertainment industry, but he had no power whatsoever in the mob. The fellow who gave me this information said, you know, that if Frank Sinatra wanted to call a strike against a movie company, he would be able to do that, but he wouldn't be able to do anything that had any kind of influence with the mob or had any negative influence on the mob. Another person who I found fascinating was a man named Louis Lepke Buchalter, who ran all the illegal unions in the garment center. And he and a man named Albert Anastasia were the bosses of a group of Italian and Jewish thugs who were professional hitmen known as, in a group known as Murder Incorporated. And the Murder Incorporated gangsters all worked on a monthly retainer. And then for individuals whom they killed, they received a special bonus. Well, Lepke was wanted by the police because someone that he had killed, he had given the order for this killing, and the person who witnessed the order testified against Lepke. And Lepke was eventually tried and convicted, and he was the only mob boss that's ever been executed in the United States by the government. He was executed in the electric chair in Sing Sing prison. And there are also groups of African-American gangsters who were associated with the mob that a lot of people don't know about. Two of them were Bumpy Johnson, and the other one was Nicky Leroy Barnes, who had served time in jail with a gangster named Crazy Joey Gallo. And Gallo decided when he was in prison that the mob had this ridiculous prejudice against using black gangsters. And he decided that they could be very valuable to him, especially in the distribution of drugs in black neighborhoods such as Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant. So he brought these black gangsters in, and they played an enormous role in the distribution of drugs and became quite wealthy. I don't know if any of you saw the movie The Irishman. One of the people I spoke with, who is a criminal defense lawyer, said that everything in that movie was really false. That the Irishman never killed Jimmy Hoffa. He was killed by a gangster in Detroit at the issuance of a Teamster gangster in New Jersey named Tony Provenzano, also known as Tony Pro. And in the movie, it also says that the Irishman killed Joey Gallo at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. As a matter of fact, there were gangsters from the Colombo family who killed Joey Gallo in the Umberto's Clam House. And they did that because Joey Gallo had arranged for the murder of Joe Colombo, who was head of the Italian American Civil Rights Organization, and they wanted to get even, and that's why he was killed. The another interesting figure in the mob was a man named Gregory Scarpa Sr., who was known as the Grim Reaper for all the people he killed. Now, I don't know if he was also an FBI informant for many years, and that's how he protected himself. The FBI permitted him to commit all sorts of crimes, and we're not sure whether they permitted him to commit some of the murders that he committed. But well, he served another interesting purpose. I don't know if you saw the movie Mississippi Burning, which stars Gene Hackman as an FBI agent who solves the murder of four famous civil rights workers who were killed in Mississippi, in Oxford, Mississippi, in the 1960s. Well, the crime wasn't solved by the FBI. It was solved by this gangster, Greg Scarpa. The FBI paid him $100,000 to go down to Mississippi and find out who killed these three civil rights workers and where were their bodies buried. They had a leading suspect in this, and he was a man who worked in an appliance store. And Gregory Scarpa went into the appliance store and bought a television set. He asked this man to help him carry it out to his car. When they put the television set on the back seat of the car, Gregory Scarpa pulled out a gun and put it to the man's head and told him to get into the car. He then drove to a deserted army barrack and proceeded to beat up this suspect. The suspect, however, wouldn't reveal any information. So Gregory Scarpa made him pull down his pants, and he said, and then he pulled out a razor, and he said, "You have 5 seconds to reveal all the information I want, or I'm going to castrate you." Whereupon the suspect revealed all the information. The FBI was so impressed with this that they then hired Gregory Scarpa to find out who had murdered a local NAACP leader in Mississippi, and he was able to solve that crime as well. What was interesting about Gregory Scarpa is he had a very bad stomach ulcers and had to go into the hospital for surgery. And it was during the AIDS epidemic, and he was worried that a blood transfusion might leave him with the AIDS virus. So he only wanted members of what was called his Borgata to donate blood for him. And one of those people was a weightlifter who injected himself with steroids to build up his muscles. And that person was HIV positive. And Gregory Scarpa contracted the AIDS virus and ultimately died from that. But prior to his death, this just goes to show you how a little crazy this man was. His son, one of his sons, was threatened by a couple of drug dealers in Brooklyn. And Gregory Scarpa said to his son, "Let's go out and find these guys." Gregory Scarpa, at the time, was under house arrest and had one of those bracelets around his ankle to determine where he was at the time. And they located these two drug dealers, and Gregory Scarpa started shooting at them from the window of his car. And one of them returned fire and shot Gregory in the eye. His son quickly drove him home, and the beeper on his ankle bracelet had gone off, and the FBI was calling his home, and they wanted to know what was going on. He picked up the phone. He said, "Nothing. I just had to go out to pick up a prescription at the drugstore." In the meantime, blood is flowing out of his eye, and to sanitize his eye, he took a bottle of whiskey and poured it into where his eye had been, into his eye socket, and then put a kitchen towel over the hole in his eye. And soon thereafter, he was taken by ambulance to the hospital. The other thing that in speaking to certain old retired mafia people whose names who didn't want me to mention their names in my book, one of the things we discussed was the movie The Godfather, and the myths that were perpetrated by that movie, and I thought that some of these would be of interest to you. If you recall, in The Godfather, there was a character named Sollozzo who wanted help from Vito Corleone to sell drugs and to have political contacts. Well, all these mafia guys told me that if he really wanted a political contacts, all he had to do was buy politicians. They're bought and paid for every day. And he said the idea that the mob does not deal in drugs is absurd. At the highest levels, they invest millions and millions of dollars into the distribution of drugs. Lucky Luciano was doing that from his home in Italy after he had been deported. They don't want low-level people dealing drugs because the jail sentences for them are so long that they feel that those low-level people might flip against them. But there's nothing wrong with bosses and captains dealing drugs, which happens all the time. The other thing that they found comical in the movie was when there was an attempted assassination of Vito Corleone. His bodyguard had called out sick, which is a sure sign that the bodyguard knows that his boss is going to be killed and doesn't want to be any place around it. I was told that if a boss is going to be assassinated, the bodyguard never calls out sick. He just steps aside and lets the killers kill their boss. That happened when Albert Anastasia was killed in the Sheridan barber shop in 1957. He was killed incidentally by Joey Gallo and his brothers. And Joey Gallo referred to them comically as the barbershop quartet because they killed Anastasia in a barbershop. But Anastasia's bodyguards left. They left him there alone. They knew what was going to be happening. If they don't leave, they wind up getting killed, which is what happened with Paul Castellano's bodyguard, Thomas Bellotti. He was shot and killed along with Paul Castellano. But when you see others being killed, like Carmine Galante, there was a famous photograph of him lying on the backyard of an Italian restaurant with a cigar protruding out of his mouth. His bosses just left. When Lucky Luciano arranged the murder of Joe Massera, he was having lunch with Joe Massera in an Italian restaurant near Coney Island. And when the killers came in, he excused himself and went to the men's room. When Dutch Schultz was killed, his bodyguards were killed along with him because they made the mistake of being with him. The other things that I was told is that when the mafia have weddings, they don't invite a lot of people to them. The only people at a mafia wedding are mafia people. They don't want the public to know about it. They don't want any kind of publicity at all like that. And also the other one I forgot to mention was Joe Colombo, who Gallo arranged to be killed, and they hired a black guy to kill Joe Colombo, and they got him phony press credentials so he could go to this Italian civil rights meeting. And as soon as he was killed, Joe Colombo's bodyguard, who stepped forward all of a sudden, he shot and killed Johnson before the police could arrest him, because they didn't want him to talk and let anyone know who had arranged this. Also, in The Godfather, it seems as if the Vito Corleone can go against the Mafia Commission. You can't. I was told. Everyone agrees, and if you don't agree, you'll wind up being killed. Also in the movie, there was a scene of a character that was based on Meyer Lansky being shot and killed. No one ever killed Meyer Lansky. He died of old age. And then finally, there's the scene in the Godfather where Michael Corleone kills a policeman in a restaurant in the Bronx, and in the mafia, they don't kill cops. There's an absolute rule against killing cops. They would never kill a cop because it would bring down the entire police force, the entire FBI, everything on them, and it would completely destroy their operations. An example of this is in the 1980s, a gangster named Constable Ferracci killed a DEA agent named Everett Hatcher. He who was involved in a drug buy. Everett Hatcher was doing an undercover drug sale to Ferracci, and Ferracci drove by suspecting that this guy was really a federal agent, and he shot him twice in the head and killed him. Well, the New York Police Department devoted every single bit of their energy to getting this guy. And when they couldn't get him, they put such tremendous pressure on the mafia that the Bonanno crime family went out and killed Ferracci. And once they did that, all the pressure was taken off of the mafia, and they were able to operate the way that they wanted to. There were. I also dealt with in my book a pair of characters known as the Mafia Cops. You may have read about them. It wasn't too long ago. There were two cops. One was named Louis Eppolito. The other was named Steve Caracappa. And they worked for the mob. They were on a monthly retainer, and they got a lot of money every time they murdered somebody. And it's been estimated that they murdered 10 or 11 different people before they were finally caught. They both were sentenced to prison and died in prison. But I interviewed the cop who caught them and the assistant DA who prosecuted them. And these were two of the most evil people that ever participated in organized crime in the United States. And organized crime is still going on. A lot of people think that since the heads of the 5 mafia families were prosecuted under the RICO statute, that ended the mafia or organized crime in New York. Well, it hasn't. I spoke with a lawyer who provides advice to members of the mob, and
45 minutes late to an hour show.
And what he told me was that they're all so frightened of the RICO statute, which can sentence them to jail for 100 years, that they want advice about what they can do to avoid government scrutiny under the RICO statute. And so they keep a very, very low profile, but they're still involved in a lot of typical mob activities. And earlier I said that the Jewish gangsters wanted their sons to go into legitimate professions. However, I forgot to mention that a lot of them inherited shares in Las Vegas casinos and other casinos that their fathers and grandfathers had an interest in. In fact, so many casinos in Las Vegas were owned by Jewish gangsters that among the mob, Las Vegas was known as Jewtown. And they had so many shell companies that it was very difficult to ascertain who actually owned what, where, and when. Though in 1978, I was at a resort in Southern California called La Costa, and I was invited to a New Year's Eve party there. And I met a man named Morris Kleinman, who had been a partner with 3 other men who had they were gangsters from Cleveland, known as the Mayfield Road Gang, and They owned the Desert Inn and Hotel and Casino and other casinos. And he was a partner with a very famous man named Mo Dalitz, who I met briefly, but didn't really have a chance to speak with him. And while I was talking to Morris, he said, you know, when we owned the Desert Inn, Howard Hughes came in and took over the top 3 floors. And because he was a Mormon, he didn't drink and he didn't gamble. And we were losing a lot of money by having them there. So we said to him, either you have to leave or you have to buy the Desert Inn. And he said, well, how much do you want for it? And we asked 4 times the value of what anyone else would pay for the Desert Inn. And he agreed to pay for it. So we sold him the Desert Inn, and then we invested in La Costa. So anyway, that's pretty much my story, and I'll be very happy to answer whatever questions you might have, and I just hope I know the answers.
If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, or if you'd like to use the raise hand feature, I will unmute you. We do have one question from one of the attendees is asking, Jeff, what borough are you originally from?
Queens.
Queens. We have a question, the mobster that was shot in the eye, did he lose his eye eventually?
He lost his eye.
Lost his eye.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's see if there's any other questions in there. We have a question. Did you see Boardwalk Empire?
No, I didn't. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, there's a lot of differences sometimes with
Well,
the motion pictures.
It's interesting the way Hollywood has treated a lot of mob stories. I'm sure a lot of you have seen Goodfellas, and when Henry Hill was in prison, it made it seem as if his wife was on welfare and she was struggling and no one would help her. Well, in point of fact, she was having an affair with the character played by Paul Sorvino, who was the boss of that crew, and apparently he took good care of her. So there are a lot of things that the movies fictionalize for dramatic effect because they think it works out better that way.
We have, let's see, a question. Okay, let me just get to. Okay, Marcia, you could unmute yourself.
Hi, from Washington, D.C. My uncle, my great uncle, when they were still living in Alphabet City, used to mention that Dutch Schultz wasn't nearly as miserly as people thought he was, because he used to stand in front of the family's kosher bakery and hand out quarters to the kids who showed up. But it also turns out that even after the family moved to Far Rockaway in Queens, that my great uncle kept up with the mafia business, because I recently found documents from the Nassau court system from Long Island that he was indicted on charges of racketeering as a bookmaker. And I'm wondering, how often do you find cases where you have younger children growing up to be like their heroes when they're in their 70s?
You mean how many people grow up to want to be mobsters?
Yes.
It's a strange profession. I mean, if one decides to go into that line of work, one has to accept the possible consequences. which could mean, spending a lot of time in jail or being murdered. And so a lot of people don't want to do that for those two reasons. Regarding the kindness and generosity of Dutch Schultz, a lot of these people were very kind to children for some reason. I spoke to someone who grew up in Red Hook, Brooklyn, was a neighbor of Joey Gallo, and he said that Joey Gallo used to buy kids in the neighborhood ice cream and candy and so forth, and was very kind and generous to them. But he could also be very brutal. After Prohibition, Dutch Schultz had two businesses that he worked in. One was controlling the numbers in Harlem, and the other was setting up associations of bakers from kosher bakeries and other kinds of bakeries,
Yep.
and also restaurants. And he would form these associations and then protect, and extract a lot of money from these people, and then supposedly to protect them from unionization, but then would threaten them indirectly with unionization, and then collect another fee for preventing their workplaces from being unionized. When he discovered that one of his collectors had stolen money from him, he was at a hotel in upstate New York, and his lawyer, a man named Dixie Davis, was with him, and his second lieutenant, and he called over this man who had stolen money from him, and he said, you stole money from me. And the guy said, but I didn't steal very much. Whereupon Dutch Schultz pulled out a gun, shoved it in the man's mouth, and blew his brains out right in front of his own lawyer and his second lieutenant. I mean, money was the god of all these people. I'm trying to remember which mafia boss said it. I'm not sure, but one of them said that a Sicilian gangster would rather eat his children than give away $1.
Attention patrons, the library will be closing in 15.
Did a Jewish gangster say that?
No, I think it was an Italian gangster, but it could have easily have been said by a Jewish gangster.
We have a lot of stories like that in my family. It's interesting.
The stories are fascinating.
Yeah, we have a story. So my great grandfather, some young man came in for some protection money, and one of them spit on his shoes. But he's a baker, so he's always covered in flour. And his older sons, he had 9 kids. His older sons, the ones who weren't in college, proceeded to beat them both up for spitting on their father's shoes. These are a bunch of like 5'5" slim Jewish dudes from New York, and it just amuses me to no end that apparently they ended up needing surgery. The two people that they beat up.
Well, if the two people they beat up had been really well-connected gangsters, the two people who beat them up probably would have been killed. So they were probably just local hoodlums who were trying to extract money out of your grandfather.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Thank you for the questions, and we have a couple more questions. We have a question about what about Jilly Rizzo? Was he high level? That was Frank's friend.
No, he wasn't. I didn't even think he was in the mob.
He was just Frank's protector. Usually, he'd throw him.
Frank had a lot of protectors. I mean, Frank always traveled around with a lot of bodyguards. A friend of mine was in went into Jilly Rizzo's bar on the West Side one night when Frank Sinatra was there, and Frank Sinatra was drunk apparently and fell off his stool, and this friend of mine grabbed him before he hit the floor And Frank Sinatra was very nice to him, very grateful, said thank you very much, and bought him a drink.
We have, let's see, when you were doing your research, did you ever feel that you were at risk physically?
No, I didn't. I asked a friend of mine who was mentioned in this book, a former New York City detective who worked in the organized crime strike force. His name was Tony Solano, who actually surveilled John Gotti and had a run-in with John Gotti, which was fascinating. But I asked him, and he said, "Look, you know, you're not saying anything really bad about these people. You're just reporting what they did, and you're not accusing them of doing anything. You're not doing anything that is going to, you know, be insulting to them. You're not calling them names. You're not making fun of them. You're doing a journalist's job, and they usually don't kill journalists."
We have a question. What kind of money did these guys actually make at various levels? And did it pay well, even if you were not the top individual?
Well, some of the people I spoke to said some of the soldiers who were the lowest level in the mafia were multimillionaires. I mean, they controlled all sorts of things and made a fortune from it. You know, some of the street level thugs, you know, probably didn't make very much money, but some of the soldiers were actually making more money than some of the captains were, because of the nature of some of the businesses that they controlled.
Oh, we have also, I'm gonna put it up there. There's a little well, first we have the cover of the book. So that's Big Apple Gangsters, the rise and decline of the mob in New York. But
yeah, you could also show some of the photos of all of these photos appear in the book, by the way.
Yeah, we have Arnold Rothstein from the early Bugsy Siegel. That's a mugshot. That's Meyer Lansky and Costello.
Frank Costello's real name, incidentally, was Francisco Castiglia, and he was married to a Jewish woman, but he chose the name Frank Costello because he had formed an alliance with two Irish bootleggers on the west side of Manhattan, and felt that it would be easier for him to deal with them and some of their associates if he had an Irish-sounding name.
I think that picture was from the Kiefer Committee.
Right. Yeah, he was questioned by the Kefauver Committee and also the McClellan Committee.
Let's see. That's Lucky Luciano.
Right.
We have that's a Dutch Schultz mugshot.
Whose real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, and he had been born into an Orthodox Jewish family and converted and became a Catholic, and was buried in a Catholic cemetery and given last rites by a Catholic priest. But his mother insisted that even though he received that from a Catholic priest, that he be buried with a yarmulke and a Jewish prayer shawl around him.
See, we have that's Lepke Buchalter.
Buchalter. His real name was Louis Buchalter. His mother rather, called him Lepke. It was a Yiddish name meaning little one or little adorable one, something like that.
And that's Albert Anastasia,
who was known as the Mad Hatter, and he took a tremendous amount of pleasure in just killing people. He loved killing people, and he had this fantastic home on the Palisades in New Jersey. And after he was killed, the comedian Buddy Hackett bought his home.
Wow. Interesting. That's Vito Genovese.
Vito Genovese was sort of like the old-time mafia guys of Joe Massera and Salvatore Maranzano. He didn't want to deal with anyone from a different ethnic group, and he almost came to blows with Frank Costello over this, because Frank just thought that Genovese was an old world bigot, and there was no room for him, and they set him Luciano, Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Carlo Gambino set it up for him to be convicted on a drug buy so they could get rid of him. And he was sentenced to 15 years in prison, where he died because Luciano and Lansky and Gambino, rather than killing this guy, which they could have done, they preferred to do things indirectly and be rather deceptive in what they were doing. And so they arranged for him to be convicted for selling heroin, and he received 15 years in prison.
We have, that's Paul Castellano.
Paul Castellano was an interesting businessman. He thought of himself more as a businessman than as a gangster. And his family was very involved in the food service business. They owned a large part of Purdue Chickens, and chain, and they had interest in some of the biggest chains of supermarkets in the New York area. He also was having, his lover was the family maid, and his wife ultimately left him over that, and he had a number of, I won't go into it, but he had a number of sexual problems.
As John Gotti, known as the Teflon Don.
Who was really an enormous fashion plate. I mean, he set the style for mafia clothing more than anyone else, and he was an extraordinarily smart man. As Tony Solano said to me, he said, in order to organize the murder of Paul Castellano and become head of the Gambino family required tremendous leadership capacity, and his leadership abilities, he said, were extraordinary. Unfortunately, he was a publicity hound, and that was part of his undoing.
Sammy, also known as Sammy the Bull Gravano, you may remember him.
He was also a very, very smart businessman, and he controlled all the cement business in the United States. And when Donald Trump was elected president, he said, what this country needs is a mob boss in the White House, because no one else can run this country other than a mob boss, which I thought was interesting.
That's Vincent, also known as Vincent the Chin Gigante. Why do they call him the Chin? I don't remember.
Well, his mother, it was a shortening of an Italian word, and I can't remember what it was, Cincina or something like that, that his mother referred to him. And when he was a boy growing up in the neighborhood in Greenwich Village, his friends just started calling him Chin, and then he became known as the Chin. And when he took over the Genovese crime family, you could never mention his name. If you wanted to refer to him, you had to point to your chin and saying, so, once this or once that, and you could never mention his name. And he perfected a role that Marlon Brando would have been envious of pretending to be insane, walking around Greenwich Village in his pajamas and his slippers and muttering to himself. And but eventually he was convicted, and he pled guilty to, one of the reasons was to protect his son from a criminal indictment. He was also the person who tried on the orders of Vito Genovese to assassinate Frank Costello, and he had gone into Frank Costello's home apartment building on the Upper West Side. It was on Central Park West, and he pointed a gun at Costello and he said, "This is for you, Frank." And just then Frank turned his head and the bullet only grazed his head, and he wasn't killed. And Frank Costello refused to testify against Gigante in court. And at trial, Gigante thanked Costello for not testifying against him. But Costello also got the message and decided to retire from the mob.
That's Joey Gallo.
Crazy Joey Gallo. It was interesting. I was talking to a friend of mine earlier whose father owned a bowling alley in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And the week before the bowling alley was to open, they had purchased cigarette machines and soda machines and coffee machines for the lobby of the bowling alley. And someone came in and said to them, you don't want these machines. You want to deal with this company. They're much, much better. And his father said, well, we already accepted money from them. He said, well, just give the money back and we'll pay you, and you put these machines in. And the machines came from the crew that Joey Gallo ran in Brooklyn. And later on, they had to hire a bouncer who was a member of the Gallo gang in order to give them employment. But he said to me, Joey Gallo was always well spoken, very, very polite. But of course, underlying all of that was the possible threat of violence if you didn't do what he wanted you to do.
Bumpy Johnson.
Bumpy Johnson was the first black man to organize the numbers and drug rackets in Harlem. He served time in prison, and he was followed by Nicky Barnes, who did the Leroy Nicky Barnes, who did the same thing. And Nicky Barnes just died recently. He had been in prison. He got out of prison and supposedly reformed his whole life. He was working as a clerk at one of the large box stores when he finally died. He said he regretted the error of his ways and was going straight, and it looked like he did.
Let's see, we have. That's Greg Scarpa.
That's Greg Scarpa, the man whose eye was shot out and who died of AIDS, and who solved the murder of the mafia killers. I'm sorry, of the civil rights workers in Mississippi in 1964. I spoke to a criminal defense attorney named Joe Goldberg, who knew Greg Scarpa, had dinner with him several times, and he said he was very, very intelligent, very well spoken, could talk about politics, international affairs, banking, all sorts of things. He was really quite a smart fellow, and while he's wearing a toupee in that photograph, and when he would go back to his haunts in Brooklyn, he would take off the toupee and proceed doing his gangster work. There are the two mafia cops, Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito, neither of whom should have been hired by the police because Louis Eppolito came from a mafia family and Stephen Caracappa had a felony arrest. But the police was so desperate for new recruits in the 1960s because of all the demonstrations and the violence and the killing of cops by radicals in the city, that they overlooked a lot of these things. And once these two guys teamed up with each other, they ran their own little execution squad out of the New York City Police Department.
Let's see. We have Marshall says, uncle was interviewed Tony Pro in Lewisburg about a DOJ case. In your research, did you find information about the mafia helping out U.S. government during World War II? And have you seen the Netflix series Fear City?
I haven't seen Fear City. And yes, the mob did help out the government in World War II. What happened was that Thomas Dewey won a prostitution a case against Lucky Luciano, who was sentenced to prison for 50 years for procuring, which is a little extreme. And his pal, Meyer Lansky, and they were like brothers, by the way, Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, they could finish each other's sentences. They remained the closest of pals. And Lucky Luciano advised all the other mob families. His advice to them was always listen to Meyer and you'll never lose a dollar. He's the smartest man I know. And they were trying to figure out a way to get Luciano out of prison. And they worked with Albert Anastasia and Albert Anastasia's brother, Tough Tony Anastasio. His last name was spelled slightly differently because Albert changed the spelling when they were young. There was a famous French liner docked in New York Harbor, and they burnt it down, and the liner flipped over on its side, and it was lying there in the docks, and people couldn't believe what happened. And this was during World War II, and the mob let it be known that this was done by Nazi saboteurs. However, Lucky Luciano could prevent all sabotage on the docks of New York through his control of the International Longshoremen Association, which at that time was controlled by Tough Tony Anastasio, and on the west side by Albert Anastasia, and also by a man named Sax Lanza, who controlled the Fulton Fish Market at the time. So they agreed. A division of the U.S. Navy formed a group, and they worked with Lucky Luciano to prevent any kind of sabotage on the docks of New York and of Los Angeles. And when the American Army invaded Italy, Lucky Luciano gave them names of mobsters in Italy who could help the American soldiers. And for that, Thomas Dewey, the man who was DA at the time, a special prosecutor at the time, rather, who convicted him, was now governor of New York, and he commuted Luciano's sentence on condition that he be deported and be sent back to Italy, which he was.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions? Let's see. Well, I thank you, Jeff, for this extremely interesting, informative talk. And the book Big Apple Gangsters is was released yesterday, and it is available in bookstores and on Amazon. And we'll have a copy at the library very soon. And we look forward to having another discussion. Maybe at some point when things change a little bit, we could do one in person.
Thank you very much, Steve. I enjoyed doing this.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for zooming in. And I hope you all have a great evening. Good night.
Good night, everyone.